it's Bogdan Trufanda and Mihai Vasilescu. I'll pass you over to them now.
Thank you. Hello everyone, thank you for having us here. It's good to be here. Today we're going to talk about crypto mining attacks and with a focus on containers. We're going to keep the rhythm up from the last talk about EKS and containers. My name is Mihai, together with me is Bogdan. We're both threat detection engineers at CrowdStrike. We mainly focus on Linux space and cloud runtime, so we love looking at these kind of attacks. The agenda for today is going to be a very short introduction on containers and container security, followed up by some information about Team TNT, which is a bigger name in the containers, let's say, security space, one of the bigger threat actors in the past couple of years. And we'll end up with a short demo, and will be available for Q&A.
Hi everyone. I will start with a brief description of containers versus VMs. So, both containers and VMs are methods of virtualizing, and if you can see in the first two layers, they need both an infrastructure and a host operating system in order to run. The difference comes from the third layer, as you can see in the picture. In the case of VM, they need a hypervisor like VMware, Parallels, and so on. And they will create an entire new operating system, including the kernel, libraries, and application, and so on. Whereas in the case of containers, the container engine, which can be Docker, Podman, or other container engines, relies on the host operating system kernel to create containers that share that kernel, and that kernel provides isolation for the containers. Now, let's see how that isolation is performed. There are multiple key features that perform this container isolation, but two of the most important ones are namespaces and cgroups. And as you can see in this picture, the namespaces limits what you can see, and the cgroups limits how much you can use. And let's see what that means. So, there are multiple namespaces, Linux namespaces, but we'll just talk about the PID namespace because the principle is the same on all of them. So if you can look here in the right picture at the top, we've created a plain Ubuntu container. And if you try to list the processes using PS, we can see that we only have the PID for the entry point and also the PID for the PS command. Whereas if you create the same container again, but this time specifying the PID equal to host, we can see that we have multiple PIDs, including the init, the kernel workers, and so on. Basically, we're able to see the PID from the host. And in order to understand why this happens, we can look in the right picture. So in the right picture, we are listing the namespaces for first, the Ubuntu user, then for the first container from here, the plain one, and in the third part, we are listing the namespaces for the container with the PID equals to host. And if you can take a look in the first and the third one, we can see that the PID inode number is the same for both the Ubuntu and the Docker container with PID equal host. So sharing, or better said, when you create that container with a PID equal host, basically it means that you share the PID namespace of the host, and that's why you can see here all the PIDs from the host. Now, moving on to cgroups. So, by default, a Docker container has no memory constraints and can use as much memory as it wants. And an attacker can easily create a basic script like this one and effectively launch a fork bomb. Let's see what happens under the hood. So if you try to list the memory.max file for both the cgroup of the container and also the cgroup of the Ubuntu user, we can see here that the value is max. So basically this means that both the user and the container can use as much memory that the hardware allows or have. Now, before moving on to the attack, we'll go very quickly about the Docker architecture. So the Docker architecture has three main parts. It has the client, which is the command line interface where you can run commands like docker build and so on. We have the Docker host, which contains the Docker daemon, which is a running background process that is waiting for commands from the Docker client. And we have a registry, which is a place where you can store your Docker images. The most well-known is Docker Hub, which is a public one, but you also can have private registry that you can host. Now, usually when you install Docker on your machine, the Docker client and the Docker daemon are running on that machine, and they are communicating over an Unix socket. But in case you need to run both the Docker CLI and the Docker daemon or two multiple machines, you can do that, and they will communicate over a TCP socket. Setting up this connection is a bit tricky, as we will see later in the attacks that we'll present.
So now that we had some information about some of the concepts around how containers work, let's try to get some information about why are containers targeted, let's say. So the main motivation around container attacks are tied to cryptojacking and essentially turning a profit. So that accounts for almost around 75% of the attacks that we notice, and the other, let's say, 25% is split around information gathering, DDoS as a service, or botnets as a service. But all these essentially still kind of tie up or focus around turning for profit. They're selling information that or credentials that they get from their targets, or they provide access to third parties for different purposes. Now, as a volume, so this is something that I pulled up just yesterday from some of the telemetry that we have. Essentially, we see roughly around 30,000 events that are related to miners just around every week. So that's over 1,000 events daily tied to miners and anything related to like scripts used by miners. Mining on itself is not illegal. The issue comes when it becomes an issue when people use this deploy miners on, let's say, somebody else's infrastructure. Most common currency that is mined are Monero, Bitcoin, Ethereum. But we've also started to see some new, let's say, coins that we haven't previously seen as often, such as Virus and others. In this space, Team TNT is one of the bigger names. You've probably seen, if you follow the news, security news around container attacks. Team TNT has been around for roughly 5 years, and they've been the, say, bigger name around this area. And they typically do around 2 or 3 bigger campaigns a year. So they started initially compromising like exposed Redis services, servers, or Jupyter notebooks that have been exposed. And then they kind of transitioned towards Docker APIs, targeting exposed Docker APIs, adding credential theft to their tool chain. And finally, they started targeting Kubernetes as well. Usually, so one of the last bigger campaigns that they had, the Gatling gun, the attack flow is fairly, and not just the Gatling gun, but fairly used kind of the same approach with Docker and Kubernetes. They usually scan for the exposed Docker APIs or Docker exposed services. In the case of Docker, then they would traditionally they would deploy some Alpine or Ubuntu vanilla flavor containers where they would follow up with their own, let's say, payloads, and then establish persistence with some C2 with some implants such as Sliver or Tsunami, and then they would start running mass scan to find other exposed containers on the internet. Aside from that, one of the let's say the latest developments, it was starting to use their own Docker Hub accounts where they post, let's say, prepared malicious images. This one has been thoroughly documented. The NMLM99 account has been thoroughly documented in the past. What's interesting about it is even after the TDGG campaign in November, they've still been experimenting with various containers and various deployments. And it's actually still up even now. I think the last activity they had was around two months ago with new images. So let's try to take a look on how they've evolved, how their techniques evolved, and how their scripts, their deployment scripts started out, and how they've evolved during this period.
Okay, so we'll start looking over their past init script, which is the first script that they executed. And their attack is pretty straightforward. They used masscan in order to scan the internet. After they found for these ports, after they found one of multiple of these ports open, they will use zgrep in order to check that indeed Docker is running on that service as not something else. And after that, they will issue a Docker command in which they will mount the host file system inside the /mount. Actually it's an Alpine plain image. Then they will change root into /mount. Basically means that everything that it's executed after that will be executed on the host file system. And then they'll just curl for that init script, pipe it into bash to execute it in memory and not leave any trace on the disk. Another thing that they did is that they renamed common binaries like curl wget, like curl bin or other names, in order to bypass some naming detection. Other than that, they started just doing the same. They started executing multiple curl commands and piping them to bash, in which they set up the xmarig or Monero miner, they set up persistence, they set up the credential steer, and so on. So nothing fancy. Okay, now moving on to some present init script. So the first part is almost identical. They still use masscan and zgrep to find exposed Docker APIs. What changed is how they create the containers. So now they execute two commands. In the first one, they execute a command using a custom Monero image that they've created and shared on Docker Hub. And the second command, they don't root anymore in /mount. They instead install whatever they need, and then they curl for their domain, for the TDG init script, and piping into bash. And after that, from the script, they root into the host file system. Now, this is their image that is still posted on Docker Hub. And if we look here on the image layers, we can see here in the last two layers that they just download the xmrig miner archive and then setting up the entry point to run the miner. Now, another very interesting thing they started to do is they renamed the xmrig miner to sbin. They use EPX to compress it. And after that, they started infecting all the running containers with Docker exec commands, and which they would execute that xmarig binary. For persistence, they used Sliver. Now, in the past, they used Tsunami. And the infection, let's say, it was pretty straightforward. They just downloaded it from their domain, and they always renamed that persistent mechanism to TMP bioset, and Sliver is just another open source adversary C2 framework. Now, another thing that they did is they listed the known hosts file, and after that they executed SSH commands, in which, they executed an encoded base64 script we can see at the top. And if you try to decode it, we can see that still more of the payload, and you can also see the TDG init script, the initial script. Now for the kubelet, for the Kubernetes part, we can see that the principle is the same as in case with Docker APIs. They still use masscan on that specific kubelet default port, and after they find the kubelet exposed, they will issue curl commands in order to gather information from that Kubernetes cluster.
Now, to take just a pause before we move on to the demo, if you look at what kind of the tools that they've been using throughout their, let's say, their activity, it's been mostly bash scripts and some, let's say, off-the-shelf tools for scanning or pivoting and whatnot, or open source tools like Sliver, etc. So there's nothing, let's say, super sophisticated that needs, reverse engineering or to get to understand how they work. They're just they are scanning, finding anything that is potentially exploitable or vulnerable, and they can easily deploy their scripts, infect the servers, and move on. So that kind of gives us also some detection opportunities. Now, for the demo, we chose to try to implement something very similar to give to get a sense of how easy this is to replicate. So what we chose, we set up our own, let's say, attacker-controlled server to scan for some Docker daemons. We set up two machines. One, we're going to infect both of them separately, one with a predefined image that we've created, a fake crypto miner. And then separately, we're going to deploy, again, an vanilla Alpine container, and we're going to deploy our own init scripts, and then try to grab some credentials and establish some persistence. Now, one of the things that we kind of recommend, we're going to go and mention later as well, is that we recommend using security, like runtime security monitoring. And for both of these demos, we've set up both of the VMs. We set up with one with a commercial tool, and then separately with an open source tool, just to get some views on like what detections we could get and how we can leverage these tools to detect and stop these sort of attacks. Let's see now. Just a second. And this is this one. So once we have identified our targets, we pretty much see the same commands that we've mentioned earlier: timeout, sigkill, Docker, deploy, connect to a host that has the Docker API exposed, and just download the container, the image, or not a fake crypto image, and run that one. And we do this for both of the targets, which are on the lower side of the screen. And we chose to present the top so we can see how the system reacts and what we can see there. So on the left-hand side, we have the commercial tool. The right-hand side, we have Falco, which is an open source tool. And now we can actually see the entry point for our container running. We set it up to run at 50% CPU just to showcase that it's still running. Now, let's try to get a look on what detections we can get from this. Okay. So on the top side here, we can see that Falco actually gets the detection. It's not going to actually stop. It doesn't have a prevention set up by default. There are some options to enable that but it's not out of the box. But you will get some information on that there's a potential crypto miner running, and there's options to see with commercial tools that the miner has started and it was actually shut down instantly. Okay, for the second demo, there we go.
Okay, so in the second demo, we'll try to replicate the part with the init script and the credentials grabber. So what we did is, actually first let me say that on the top is the, let's say, attacker control terminals, and on the bottom we have the targets. And in the first here on the top on the left, we are running a Docker command in which you root into the mount, and then we execute for a curl command that downloads that init file, and then we execute it. And what that init file is doing is adding SSH key to authorized keys. It adds a cron job, and then it's trying to grab some credentials that it can find on the target. And here at the bottom, we can see here first that a cron job was added for root, in which every minute it's executed a curl command for cron.sh file that's executed into bash. And here at the bottom, we can see that a public key was added in the authorized key. Also, on the top right, we can see that there are some 4 files created that contains credentials for the docking login and also for the etc password file. Okay? Here at the bottom, we can see the detection in Felco, and we can see here that there was some keys that were added. And you can see here that we get a detection almost every minute. And in the commercial tool, we can see that this process was killed that was trying to add a cron. Now, let's see why these kind of attacks are easy to do. Well, if you try to Google for top 10 Docker security best practices, it's possible that you will find an image like this one. Well, the problem is yes, these are good practices to do, especially for developers that manage the containers. But the sad part is that the attackers don't care about them. And why they don't care about them? Well, because when you expose your Docker API, basically you are giving the attacker entire control over your Docker infrastructure. So for example, let's take one, I don't know, let's see, the lint Docker file. So it says that make sure you scan your Docker files, give it a try to linters. Well, this is useful, for example, when you're a developer and you try to create secure Docker container based on a Docker file. But in case of attackers, they have total control of how they can create their containers, and they practically bypass every one of these good practices. But there is one of them there that it states that don't expose the Docker daemon socket. So basically, if you remember the architecture that Mihai presented, their first step in the kill chain was that they were scanning the internet and in order to find Docker daemons or expose Docker daemons. If you don't expose the Docker daemon, basically you just cut their entire kill chain and they can't infect you anymore. Now, it's possible that in some scenarios you may need to expose your Docker API. And in case you need to do that, what you can do is Docker provides a method in order to authenticate the requests based on TLS certificates. So in case you really need to expose your Docker API, you can use certificates so that in this case the attacker can no longer run their own containers. Now, another thing is to use runtime security monitoring. You can use open source, commercial, whatever you want. And another thing to mention here that is often mislooked is running Docker in rootless mode. And we'll go back a little bit to namespaces. And here we have two examples on the left. So we create a container here at the top with Docker, and here at the bottom we create a container with Podman, which is another container engine. So here in the first picture, first we list the user namespace of the Ubuntu user, then create the container, list the container user namespace, and then we try to root into mount and do a ls root, and you can see that we can see the snap folder. Okay, now if you take a look over the inode numbers of the user namespace, you can see that they're pretty much the same. So basically, when you do a root/mount, you just basically perform a container escape. Now, if we go here and look over the Podman example and do exactly the same thing, we can see that when we enter or land inside the container and try to list the container user namespace, you can see that the inode number is different than the Ubuntu one. And if you try to escape the container with croot, we can see that we get a permission denied. And basically, why this happened and why is this difference is because of Linux. So if you look at the right side picture, and if you try to list the user namespace of the Ubuntu user, and after that we switch to the root user, if you list for both users the namespace, you can see that it's the same, because in Linux there was by default only one user namespaces. So that's why in the case of containers, or Docker container, it works, because by default when you create a container, it's just using the Ubuntu user namespace. In case of Podman, it creates another user namespace, and that's why you can't escape it anymore using this technique.
So finally, as I think the takeaway from this presentation is not necessarily that Docker is bad or there's that you should use some security tool. One of the things that we wanted for you to take away is that runtime security tools are important, and whether you use a commercial or an open source one, that's absolutely fine as long as you get some information from what's going on in case of attacks. And the other thing I think is that there's a big difference in between like good security practices from a developer standpoint, limiting resources to containers, or making sure that that applications don't run as root. But once you're able to escape from that container, by default you're going to end up in a privilege escalation situation. And that kind of the approach for best security practices for a developer are different for, let's say, defense. And that's something that should be taken into consideration. And finally, one of the aspects that we found fun was that during the demo that it took us roughly a couple of hours to set up the whole infrastructure for the demo, set up a VM, build a fake crypto miner, credential theft, and all that, and target some of our, let's say, some VMs that we already knew we were going to use for the target. But that's a couple of hours to set up an infrastructure for attack once, let's say, a new vulnerability arises. Yeah. So let's say you don't have a Docker API exposed, but you'll have something like Redis, or there's a new CV, or whatever in some application that runs in a container widely. That's a couple of hours until someone can set up their whole shop to target you. If you don't have something to protect yourself, again, runtime security tools, open source, commercial, whatever, that leaves you in a pretty bad position, I'd say. So yeah, thank you for attending. If there's any questions.
Does anybody have a question at this time for the guys? No? Okay, thank you. They'll be around, and you can also reach out through the Discord channel as well. So, guys, thank you very much.